Hey guys, welcome back to 2 straight weeks of Doctor Who. We are doing all things Doctor Who ahead of and surrounding the 60th anniversary specials. Today we are continuing our series of ranking every episode of Doctor Who by season. Today we are on series 6. So this is the 6th series of the revived version of Doctor Who starting in 2005. Series 6 aired in the year 2011. This was Matt Smith's second season in the role of the 11th Doctor. We are going to be ranking all 13 episodes from that season along with the following 2011 Christmas special. So go check out the previous 5 episodes that we have on our channel. We will be doing this, like I said, for the next week at least. We've already done it for the last 5 days. This is day 6 of our 2 weeks of Doctor Who. So let's start from the bottom. I only have one episode in F tier here, and we are going to start with the Christmas special, The Doctor, the Widow, and the Wardrobe. Now, this is my least favorite Christmas and holiday special they've ever done. I think the ideas were there, but I don't think the execution was there at all. I think the humor is very childish and a lot of it lands really flat. I think this is to the point where the 11th Doctor got to his worst version. Matt Smith is very campy, very over the top, way too silly for his own good. Doesn't have any of those intense, charming qualities that I like about the 11th Doctor at the start of his tenure in Series 5. Amy and Rory are completely gone from the cast at this point based on their storylines. So we have, is it Madge Arwell and her 2 kids? I like that they've borrowed kind of this Narnia aspect to it, but everything about this episode really falls flat. I don't like the villains in the episode, if you can even consider it a villain. This episode kind of relies more on suspense than it does actual villains in the piece. It's kind of just a misunderstood alien species that don't really pose any real threat to the characters. It has a feel-good ending that doesn't necessarily feel deserved from my point of view. Every time I watch this episode, it starts really cute, it starts really charming, and it just becomes a slog by the end of it, and to the point where this could be an episode I never watch again, and I'd be totally fine with that. It wastes a couple of good comedians in the Forrester roles, and it kind of wastes this really cool Narnia-esque setting to me. I don't think there are really any redeeming qualities about this episode, except for maybe the performance of, I can't remember the actress who plays Madge. She has her moments, but even then it's a little too woe is me, pity me, I'm all sad kind of thing. I don't love this episode by any means, but that being said, it is the only Series 6 related episode that I have down in F tier. So let's move up then to the 2-parter, The Rebel Flesh and The Almost People. Now, I'm going to put The Rebel Flesh higher than The Almost People. The Almost People, both episodes have very similar qualities to me. So I didn't separate them very much. It's got this, kind of like the last episode we just ranked, it's got this cool concept of like doppelganger people, grown clones of people, disposable human workforce. It adds this very gothic atmosphere. I kind of do like the setting of these episodes, but none of the characters are really redeeming for me. I wish it was a little more, pardon my pun, a little more fleshed out, even for a 2-parter. It just feels like nothing happens, and I wish more happened, if that makes any sense. This didn't feel like it needed to be a 2-parter, but at the same time, with all of the time that we spend with the characters, it feels like a lot of the side characters aren't developed at all. I like the ending of the 2nd episode, what with them kind of challenging the corporate establishment back on, I can't remember if it's back on Earth or where exactly. I think it is back on Earth, but then of course you have the The cliffhanger with Amy being a ganger the entire time, and that's why we've seen kind of these flashbacks the entire first half of series 6. But yeah, all in all, I think the conflict is really contrived. I don't think it's very well written. And I've never really connected with anything about this episode. This is another one I could skip on all of my rewatches, except, like I said, for the last 5 minutes of the second part of this episode. I think the setup is a little better than the actual delivery in the second half, and that's why I have the first half higher than the second half, but both of them sit pretty firmly in D tier for me. Next, we're staying in D tier. It's going to be closing time. Now, I mentioned in yesterday's episode, I actually don't mind James Corden in the his first episode with Craig Owens. But when he comes back and is used in a very one-note performance. Like, he doesn't have to be here. This episode is literally just here to be filler. It does tell kind of this cool story of the Doctor revisiting all of his past before his final day, but most of that emotion is really overshadowed by the Cybermen. The Cybermen are at arguably their most disposable here. They're least threatening. You have a lot of the gay jokes between the Doctor and Craig that they don't age necessarily poorly, because most of them are done in not egregious taste, but they, like, most of the jokes aren't actually that funny to begin with, and so here we sit, 10, 12 years later. I could go without all the gay jokes. I think this is where the Doctor is, again, kind of at his comedic worst. He's really at this, which is weird, because, like, Matt Smith does bring a performance in certain parts of this episode that's very, like, end of the line for me. I'm about to die. I'm going out with a bang. You can see the emotion in my eyes, kind of thing. But at the same time, then, the Doctor is way too comedic, way too goofy, way too doesn't understand human interaction. All of the worst bits about the 11th Doctor are on display in this episode for me. This is an episode that didn't have to happen. It's a filler episode, and I think it sits firmly in D tier there for me. Moving up then, just double checking, we have one more in D tier, which isn't a good sign for Series 6. I used to love Series 6. It was my, upon my first watching, actually, of Doctor Who, I really connected with Season 6. This is where I really fell in love with the show, and fell in love with Stephen Moffat's writing, and it has just aged really poorly for me. But the finale, The Wedding of River Song, sits in D tier for me. There were a lot of cool ideas at the start of this episode. They built up. They didn't really build it up. It just kind of happened. That's why it should have been a two-parter, but it wasn't. It was just a one-part episode of a finale. And I think there are too many ideas that don't get fleshed out, and everything happens at once, literally and figuratively, in this episode, and none of it lands. There's the cop-out with the Tesselecta when the Doctor isn't actually killed, but time thinks he's killed, kind of thing, where you have this established fixed point in time, and the Doctor still cheats it on a technicality, and I think Stephen Moffat really wrote himself out of this one in a way that I don't really agree with. I think this episode was written very lazily, especially the second half of this episode. A lot of cool ideas, like I said, in the first half that they don't really build up. They just kind of appear there, but they don't really go anywhere. Nothing really happens with this episode. It's one of, if not the weakest, especially of the first 10 seasons. This is probably the weakest of the series finales. We'll get to Hellbent when we get to Hellbent, but I think this one sits firmly in D tier for me. So, of the 13 episodes, those are the first 5. We're now moving up to C tier, and immediately above D tier, in C tier, bottom of C tier, I have the pirate episode, The Curse of the Black Spot. Now, this is a very gimmicky episode. We see a lot more gimmicky episodes with Series 7 as we move into Series 7 tomorrow. We'll talk more about those episodes, but this one still has a little bit of charm. Obviously, the momentum that started with the first 2 episodes in Series 6 is kind of given a back seat. They lose a lot of the momentum with this episode, but upon rewatch, This episode on its own isn't that bad, in my opinion. I think it's a pretty middle tier episode. I like the Siren as a villain. I like this idea of kind of this intergalactic holographic nurse that rescues people in a way that is suspect, and this whole concept of people not understanding the science behind it, and so it appears like magic, it appears like fairy tale. I always like when Doctor Who does those kinds of episodes. I think the tension between the captain and his son in this episode could be written a little better, could be fleshed out a little more, and I think a lot of the side characters are just kind of there to be there. They're not really well written at all, not developed. And that might be kind of the point, because the focus of this episode is on Amy and Rory and is on the captain and his son. Like I said, I think this is a pretty middle tier episode. I like the setting. I don't think it goes too campy with the pirate stuff. I think it is handled very maturely and very appropriately, and I think it sits firmly bottom of C tier there. Let's move up then to Let's Kill Hitler. Now, there are a couple words that I don't know if I can actually use on YouTube, but as of me recording this video, my channel is not yet monetized, so I'm not too worried about it. I don't love the setting of this episode. No, I'm not saying I don't think a Nazi wartime episode setting is bad necessarily. I just think that the CGI used in this episode is really poor. I think the set design, the production design in this episode is really poor. I think the writing in this episode is really poor. There are cool moments in this episode, especially at the end of the episode with the whole dynamic between the Doctor and River, and then Amy too. It sets up the Tesselecta so they have the cop-out at the end of the season. I don't love the inclusion of the Tesselecta. I don't love the inclusion of Nazi Germany as the backdrop of this episode. I shouldn't say the last 5 minutes, but it's kind of just the resolution to this story I do kind of like, but everything else about it I think is really poor. They had a season and a half to build up this Mel's character, and she just appears out of nowhere. This is a character we'd never heard of before this episode. She just appears out of nowhere, as if the show expects us to find out her being River is this huge revelation. This is a character we've never met before. They just threw her into this episode to add extra time to the episode, extra tension to the episode. I don't like the stuff at the beginning with the cornfield. I don't like all of the rewriting of Amy and Rory's backstory at the beginning to fit this narrative. I think most of this episode is really poor. I do like the character stuff at the end of the episode, and that's, I think, the redeeming factor for this. It is a character piece by the end. I wish the other 5/6 of this episode were written a little better and a little more cohesive, but I think it sits firmly mid to bottom of C tier there. Moving up then to Night Terrors is also still in C tier. I think this episode does horror fairly well. The dollhouse setting is genuinely scary, especially as a kid. The nursery rhymes and the laughing and the peg dolls all work really well to establish this very creepy atmosphere, and that is matched then with kind of this not quite horror-esque, but how do I describe it? The whole public housing unit being kind of flipped on its head to make it seem like something isn't quite right. I think they do that atmospherically very well. I think the production design in this episode is phenomenal when compared to something like Let's Kill Hitler. This was only one episode later. I think it was just one episode later. And I think they do it really well. I like the dynamics between the Doctor, Amy, and Rory here. I think that is one of the stronger... I think this episode is one of their stronger showings in season 6 as a trio, and their dynamic. I like the little comedic bits at the beginning, but I think the tension and the suspense of this episode is in top form. That being said, I think the the child acting and all of the stuff with the resolution of the kid being an alien who just kind of appeared out of nowhere and rewrote himself into this family's history is a little bit contrived in its execution. They're basically stealing this character out of nowhere aspect that Moffat didn't realize he wrote in the last episode, it seems. And so this following Let's Kill Hitler was a little bit jarring, but I think most of this episode, the rest of it works for me. I don't love the resolution, but the atmosphere of this episode propels it to middle of C tier, at least, above all of the episodes below it, and that's why I've set it where I have. Let's move up then to B tier. So of the 14 episodes that we have, 8 of them are going to be C tier or lower, which is kind of a shame, but we move up now to A Good Man Goes to War. Now, a lot of people love this episode. This is kind of the 11th Doctor specifically, his climax, where we see all of his allies coming together. The problem is all of these allies that they allude to in this episode, a lot of them we'd never seen before. So we'd never seen the Paternoster gang before this episode. We had never seen, I shouldn't say we'd never seen, we see a lot of, like, the captain and the son from the pirate episode are back in this episode. I like all of the character beats with Rory. We feel kind of this propulsion of his character forward in this episode, where he really steps into his own in caring for Amy in their relationship. The Doctor is fun in this episode, and he's also very threatening in this episode, which works in this episode, but when you look on the greater scale and see the episodes surrounding it, it kind of feels like it comes out of nowhere, and it kind of feels like it's unearned. We felt like the Doctor was a threat in Series 5, his first season as the 11th Doctor, but it feels like they've kind of lost that progression by the middle of Series 6. That being said, it is still a fun episode. It's an action-packed episode. We get the huge reveal of who River Song is, of who Amy and Rory's daughter is, of who the Doctor's wife is, and I think that is part of why people remember this episode. One of the more redeeming qualities of this episode. I like the character dynamics in this episode. I like the introduction of the Paternoster gang. I think all of the Doctor's allies are really fun in this episode. But like I said, the writing comes a little bit out of nowhere. We end on this huge cliffhanger in the previous episode, and it feels like at the same time it's a continuation of it, but we also missed a lot in between the two. And the Doctor's character specifically comes a little bit out of nowhere. So I'm going to put it bottom of B tier. That's where I personally think it belongs. Let's move up then to the God Complex. This is also going B tier. This is the hotel episode. What Night Terror does as kind of this suspense horror, the God Complex does as a suspense thriller. This is not quite a horror-esque episode, but definitely takes inspiration from something like The Shining. What's that John Cusack movie where he's stuck in that one hotel room? I think it takes a lot of elements from hotel-based horror, which is actually a bigger subgenre of horror than you'd think it is. I like the atmosphere. I think all of the characters are really well written. I love the side characters in this episode. This is one of the best written character pieces in Matt Smith's run. And I really, really do like it. I think the ending is where it loses itself for me. I don't love the reveal of the Minotaur. I think the Minotaur would have been a better villain just as kind of this unseen horror, if that makes any sense. And I understand why they revealed him. It makes sense given where the story goes, but I think they could have directed the story in a different direction, especially with the... I feel like Amy and Rory leaving, while it makes sense, I think it's a little bit forced, and especially when they come back for the beginning of Series 7, I feel like that moment at the end of this episode feels very unearned. And those would be the only negatives I have about this, but I think, like I said, the writing in this episode is phenomenal. The character bits, all of the acting in this episode is great. I'm putting it firmly top of B tier for me. And let me double check. I don't think I have any Series 6 episodes above it. So the last 4 are all going to be A or S tier. Let's move up then to Impossible Astronaut Day of the Moon. Now, the first time I ever watched Series 6, after I got done with this two-parter, they became my favorite episodes. And I think these 2 episodes are part of why Series 6 was my favorite season for so long. I like just kind of this out of nowhere, jump on into it feel that the first half of this two-parter portrays. And I like the first half. I like the first episode better than the second episode, but I don't think the second episode drops the ball necessarily the same way a lot of two-parters do, especially in Doctor Who. I think the setup is great. There's a lot of mysteries that they build up at the end of the first episode. What with the Doctor dying, what with who the kid is, why there's the spacesuit, who's in the spacesuit, what is going on with all of these silent creatures. And I think they deliver on almost all of them by the second episode. I think the resolution with killing the silence at the end of the second episode is really well handled. I think the writing is pretty airtight. It does leave a couple loose ends to set up the rest of the series, which I like in execution of this two-parter, but as the series goes on, a lot of them are mishandled and don't really go anywhere. So it kind of sets up a lot of things that I wish would have been handled better, but that's no fault of this episode on its own. I really like the setting of this episode. I like the atmosphere of these episodes. I think all of the characters are very well written. I really like Canton as a side character. I like Nixon in this episode, and that's not something you usually say. Even in Doctor Who, that's not a common take that you usually see in any media. But I do really like the setting. I like the writing in this episode. I think Moffat does not his best work in this two-parter, but Moffat's kind of the king of the setup, and I think this is his best setup of any of his series openers, of any of his storyline episodes. I think it sets up season 6 very, very well. It's just a shame that it kind of collapsed under the weight of what these 2 episodes set up. Next, we are going up to The Doctor's Wife. Now, The Doctor's Wife was written by Neil Gaiman, and I think this is his magnum opus when it comes to Doctor Who. This episode is a character piece about the relationship between the Doctor and the TARDIS, and it's set up in very distinct halves. You have the half with the Doctor and the TARDIS and figuring out how to get the TARDIS back into her body, and at the same time you then have this kind of horror-esque escapade on the other side between Amy and Rory and the villain House, who is trying to take over the shell of the TARDIS. I like this episode's atmosphere. I like that they kept basically this entire episode very dark, very atmospheric, very gothic horror. This feels like a Tom Baker episode. If you're familiar with kind of his... who was the showrunner before John Nathan Turner? The early Tom Baker episodes, what with like the Mask of Mandragora and Talons of Wang Chiang, it kind of has that gothic atmosphere to it. I really like that. I think the 11th Doctor, Matt Smith specifically, does very well in this episode. I think the Rory and Amy dynamic is at one of its best points in this episode. We kind of see a setup for The Girl Who Waited, flipped on its head when Rory is basically there waiting for Amy for his entire life, in just kind of this little hallucination scene that we get. I like that they go back and show the former TARDIS interior. I think that's really cool, a cool little throwback. We haven't seen that interior since... We've seen it once since, and I think that was Day of the Doctor. I don't think we've seen it apart from those 2 episodes since David Tennant left the role. But I like this episode. I think it's pretty Loctite. I think it's a beautiful character piece. I think the acting is phenomenal in this episode, and I think there's only one episode in Series 6 that is better than The Doctor's Wife. But for me, it still is an S tier, and that is The Girl Who Waited. Now, before I talk about why it's not S tier, let's talk about all the great things in this episode, because for me, it is the best episode of Series 6. We see Karen Gillan at her best performance. I'm not a huge fan of Amy. I've talked about it before. I'll go in depth more on that when I do a whole companion ranking tier list. But we see a better character progression for Amy in this episode than we do in all 2.5 seasons that she is in the show. I like that they start the episode where they do. It just kind of comes out of nowhere. The whole episode is just a really fast-paced ride, despite being kind of this reflective character piece. I love character pieces in Doctor Who. This is a reflection of Amy's character, of Rory's relationship with her and his commitment to his wife. This is probably the episode where Rory's character development really forces itself forward in a positive way. I love Rory. I think Rory is my favorite companion by the end of his run in the middle of Series 7, and I think this episode is really where he came into his own. We got glimpses of it with Good Man Goes to War, but we really started to feel like Rory was just a solid human being by the end of this episode, and we really started to doubt the Doctor and his relationship with his companions in this episode. I love the setting. I think the production budget on this episode was used perfectly. It's almost got, if you remember in Series 10, the episode Extremis, where it's got kind of these projected rooms on every aspect of this kind of this, how do I describe it? What I'm trying to say is that episode, I think, recycled a lot of ideas from this episode in terms of the room where the hub room, if that makes any sense. An interesting fact that I found, Series 8, when we're introduced to Missy in kind of the Paradise Garden, where she introduces all these characters to heaven, that's the same set that they use for the garden in Apalachia in this episode. Imelda Staunton, Dolores Umbridge, or Queen Elizabeth II, she does the voice of the interface. I think she does great in just kind of this minor role. I like the Handbots inclusion. I think that really helps propel what we understand about Amy's character progression forward. I think this is a very solid episode. And why don't I have it S tier? That's a good question, because it's very high up on my list of A tier episodes, but why do I have it less than S tier? I think part of it comes down to it doesn't, like, the ending of this episode is very, very good, very, very impactful, heartfelt, but it doesn't quite get to that point that I want out of my S tier episodes. And I really can't give an explanation better than that. I want this to be an S tier episode, and for whatever reason, I can just never get myself to put it there. But easily the best episode of Series 6, in my opinion. I think this is up there with the best. It's just lacking something for me, and I can't put my finger on exactly what it is. Maybe by the time I rank all of these episodes together, I will change my mind about putting it less than S tier. But I think it sits firmly top of A tier, not quite in S tier. But that being said, the shape of Series 6 on this tier list does kind of point to an F. And it is very bottom heavy, in my opinion. So of the 14 episodes that we have for Series 6, we have one in F tier. That is the Christmas special, The Doctor, the Widow, and the Wardrobe. Number 13, we move up to D tier. We have The Almost People. Number 12, The Rebel Flesh. Number 11, Closing Time. Number 10, The Wedding of River Song. Moving up to C tier. Number 9, The Curse of the Black Spot. 8, Let's Kill Hitler. 7, Night Terrors. Moving up to B tier. 6, Good Man Goes to War. 5, God Complex. 4, Day of the Moon. 2, 3, The Impossible Astronaut. 2, The Doctor's Wife. And number 1, top of Series 6 in A tier, is going to be The Girl Who Waited. Those are my opinions. Let me know what you think down in the comments section below. Like, share, subscribe. Check out our Patreon if you want to get involved with this channel. We will be back tomorrow for both the Series 7 ranking episode and our first of 2 weekly live streams tomorrow at 4 o'clock Central, 2 o'clock Pacific. So join us for that. We will see you very, very soon.